evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Danube Institute. It was Samuel Johnson who said, "The prospect of being hanged concentrates the mind wonderfully." And he said it was concentrated the mind wonderfully in a fortnight. Well, we've got about 6 weeks, if the latest political machinations are to be believed. There are various reprieves. I think we have a file and a cake coming from somewhere, potentially. But this is where we are right now. And as any condemned man might do in our cell, we turn back to the past, to the good not done, the time torn off unused. And to our central purpose, we are a think tank, and so far we've spent 13 years in the tank and thinking, coming up for air occasionally, but we've thought about all kinds of things in that period. We've thought about the problems of Hungary, the problems of the broader West, the problems of Christian civilization, birth rates, oil pipelines, Hungary's role in hybrid warfare, the MAGA movement. But above all, we've thought about how we are to live. Certainly at our best, we have, in the slightly nostalgic way you might if you were in your prison cell. There are people on a rock, and it's spinning, and somewhere in all of that, there are think tanks whose job it is to neither be the lofty climbs of academia, nor to be the sort of cut and thrust, day-to-day chip paper of tomorrow of journalism and what you might call retail politics. And it's to think about why we do all of this, and we could do it better. It's to take a break, to look up and go, what's the situation here? And could we find practical ways to improve things for humanity in the broadest sense? And as such, our work on family policy in particular was taken up by the last Hungarian government, and maybe even some of our work might be taken up by the next Hungarian government. It is presented in an open fashion. And in fact, I'd like to draw your attention to one paper in particular on hybrid warfare that was presented before me a couple of weeks ago by our researcher Norbert Sari as a good example of something that feels like it will be germane. It's a question without a particular answer because it concerns hybrid warfare, drone flies over your border, where did it come from, who sent it, what was the message behind sending it? And this is the world of diplomacy, it is the world of intelligence, but it's also the world of human judgment. It's how we come to know the world. There are things which are probabilistically true, but they can never be taken as absolute facts. It's not epistemology, to give a 10-cent word. It is ontology. Epistemology is how we come to know, and ontology is more, why do we do things? What's the right thing to do? Well, tonight we have a very special presentation for you on a subject that has often been treated as epistemology. Essentially, climate change has always been something in the public realm where academics and dissidents have traded blows, and IPCC reports and Michael Mann's infamous hockey graph. They've talked about temperature bulbs at airports. That has been a cause of some conflagration. That is widely known, but the question that always gets pushed out is, if there is some effect, and it has some affect, it affects us in our lives, what should we then do about that? What risks are worth mitigating? What risks are simply risks? What's the cost to us in material, in GDP, to go down one road? And what is the cost, again, to our immortal souls, if we then focus society solely around mitigating this one particular risk? Having spent the last 20 years haggling over a hockey stick, we now found ourselves in a moment of unparalleled technological progress, after all, and we might be beginning to feel a little bit silly. In the next decade, I hate to tell you, we may see the rise of artificial general intelligence. We might see machines that build machines that build machines, asteroid mining, Dyson swarms beaming back energy from the sun to the earth, and longevity escape velocity. Talk to me more about that after. How then will these debates of our bean counting age look? Nothing inside the models really offers any clue. Nothing inside the extravagantly financed climate movement, with its many think tanks groaning with development industry cash, tells us very much about that question. And that is what we want to discuss tonight. Because at its best, the Danube Institute has always had a kind of privileged position. We've been of the Anglosphere, but not really within the Anglosphere. We've sat here on the banks of the green, greasy Danube and fired our work into the English-speaking world in its broadest sense, to America and to Europe and beyond. And we've been able to do that because we have a particular position within that. We're not part of that world. We're not sort of constrained, hemmed in by the day-to-day cut and thrust policy debates that are happening in the politically correct wilds of England, America, Australia, etc. So that is our privilege. So we've been free to ask the big questions. Questions like, is climate change about saving the planet or saving ourselves? And if so, how might we be saved? Tonight's sermon comes from the Right Reverend Dr. Calum TM Nicholson, incidentally, vaguely piratical and Director of Research at the Danube Institute. And he will be joined tonight, after his 20 or 30-minute presentation, by Rupert Darwell. So Rupert is a strategy consultant and a policy analyst. He taught economics and history at Cambridge University and became a special advisor to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Finance Minister of the United Kingdom. He's also the author of the books The Age of Global Warming, A History, 2013, and Green Tyranny, Exposing the Totalitarian Roots of the Climate Industrial Complex. So once Rupert's here, we'll all have a bit of a chat, and we'll go from there, and at the end there'll be time for questions. So Dr. Nicholson, I presume, please give us the brimstone about why we are not about to be consumed by fire and brimstone.
Okay, thank you very much, Gav. I'm not going to stand in front of you because I can't talk sitting down or think sitting down or standing up sometimes. But here I am anyway, and I have to think and talk. So thank you very much to everyone for coming here today. As Gav mentioned, we're not sure how many more events we have, hopefully forever, but certainly this is my last one on the books right now, for now. So I'm very grateful for everyone coming. I should also note my dad is here, so thank you for coming, Dad. So he's the one hiding in the front. It's the first time he's ever seen me talk, actually, interestingly. So maybe it's still not the first time. Okay, but so today we're here to talk about how to think about climate change, and I'm very honored to be joined by Rupert Darwell, who's, as Gav has described, is a brilliant commentator on these issues, written some fantastic books. The title's How to Think About Climate Change. In a sense, though, as Gavin has sort of alluded to in talking about think tanks, this is as much a talk about thinking as it is about climate, because I think the way we think about climate and some of the problems in how we think about climate replicate across a lot of issues we face in the world today. And of course, one of the patterns we face in the world today, particularly in the West, is a great deal of political polarization, where whatever your chosen topic or hobby horse is, you'll probably find someone who not only disagrees with you, but probably thinks you're a bad person for thinking what you believe. And that goes for both sides of the spectrum. Climate change, in many ways, is the classic case of this, that it's a case of a topic which has become very politically polarized. As we know, there is kind of the sort of activist side who think that climate change is happening, we are responsible, and we need to do something about it immediately. And then, of course, there's a kind of denier side, which are kind of sometimes saying either it's not happening, or if it is happening, it's not our fault, and maybe something needs to be done, or nothing. And so there's these two sides that caricature each other. I don't think either is as simplistic as it looks. But here's my proposition to you that I'll come back to in this talk, and I'll talk for maybe, hopefully, 25 minutes, but you never know with me, maybe it's longer. So here's what my proposition to you is that if you think about climate change, why do we care about it? Well, we care about it because we presume that it will have an impact on society that'll be negative. if we didn't think of it have a negative impact on people, in a sense we wouldn't care. I mean, the polar bears are great, but even the polar bears, the loss of the polar bears is in some sense because of us. It's because of ecosystems, or we just like the look of them. And they like the taste of us, so it balances out. But so that we care about climate change because we presume it will have a social impact that will be negative. But there's a problem with that assumption. It assumes not only that we know about the science of climate change, but also what society is, and indeed what society ought to be. My proposition to you is the debate around climate change is, yes, informed by a very rich understanding of the science, the physical science. But I think the debate is as informed, I'd put it to you, by an impoverished understanding of ourselves. And I think that if you look at the spectrum, where you have the sort of denier side that deny the science, I think they have too little faith in the science, quite honestly. The science and the stuff is reasonably good. Rupert may contest this. But my reading, and I'm not a scientist, and I've heard from some people, the science is not necessarily that bad. The IPCC reports are actually quite good on the science. But so the idea would be that the climate denier lot have too little faith in the physical science. But my argument would be that the climate activist side have the opposite but equal problem of too much faith in the social science. And I want to kind of talk less about the science in this, because I'm not a scientist. Rupert knows more about this than I do. But what I can talk about is the social science. My background's in anthropology, and I've done some other stuff around the social sciences. I'm more interested in people than things. I have some thoughts on that, which I hope the result of this will be to provoke you, maybe not to new facts, but to look at the facts through a slightly different lens, a kind of gestalt shift. If you saw a duck, suddenly you see a rabbit. If you know that image of the duck and rabbit, that look like there's the same image. And that's kind of the point of what I want to say. So, to begin though, I want to start with a story, which may seem to have nothing to do with climate change, because in fact it has nothing to do with climate change, but there's a relevance in it. So on the 31st of May, 1970, a massive earthquake hit Peru. It was 7.7 on the Richter scale, and it killed, I think, 70,000 people, destroyed 200,000 buildings, and it left about 500,000 people homeless. To this day, I believe, it is the most disastrous natural disaster that has hit the Western hemisphere in recorded history in terms of its human impact. It was a huge catastrophe, flattened Peru. And what happened is that but about 20 years later, an anthropologist called Anthony Oliver Smith wrote a paper called Peru's 500-year earthquake. So first, any guesses why he called it Peru's 500-year earthquake? What did the 500 years mean? Any guesses? Any suggestions? What was he referring to? Peru's 500-year earthquake. Okay. Say again? Cycle every 500 years? Sure. Any other guesses? Impact? Meaning what? Let's take 500 years to recover? Yeah. Okay, so there's various answers people give. The worst for 500 years, a cycle of 500 years, takes 500 years to rebuild. He actually meant something slightly different. He was saying that it took 500 years for Peru to reach the state where it was vulnerable to such a disastrous earthquake. So what did he mean? Well, let's pull back a little bit. The Andes have been populated by people since 10,000 years ago. And the thing is, that area has always been an earthquake zone. And for all those 10,000 years, people knew this. They had passed it down through oral memory. And they made certain adaptations. So for instance, they built houses in a way where the walls were not cemented together, but were tied together so they could move freely in an earthquake. And they didn't tile the roofs, they put thatch, straw on the roofs, so if it fell in, it didn't cause a head injury. They kept storehouses of grain in case an earthquake happened, so that people could be fed if there was some sort of disaster. And they did not build cities or towns at the epicenter of the earthquake, which happened to be the best place to build a town, a fertile plain around a river. And as we were here in Budapest, because between Buda and Pest was the river. Rivers are a great place to build cities, at least before the invention of the car or the truck. So they made all these adaptations. And then suddenly, 500 years ago, something happened. Any guesses what happened in Peru 500 years ago? Unpopular answers only. Sean? Europe, there we go, Europe, right. So Europe showed up and colonialism showed up. And so what happened then? Well, guess what? The Spanish showed up and they started building in the Spanish style. So instead of tied together walls, they cemented them together. Instead of hay on the roofs, they had tiled roofs, pan-tile roofs. Instead of storehouses of grain, they took the storehouses as tax. And then they built a city at Arequipa. And in fact, they didn't just build it, they rebuilt it and rebuilt it and rebuilt it because it was knocked down by earthquakes in the 17th century alone 4 times. And so what then happened by 1970s, you had 3 factors come together. You had centuries of maladapted culture. That was imported culture, not sensitive to the environment. You had massive population growth because, hey, it was the 20th century. And third, you had the mother of all earthquakes hit. And so guess what happened? The walls fell out into the streets, crushing people. The roofs fell in, killing the people inside. There was no storehouses to feed people otherwise. And everyone was concentrated in places like Arequipa, where the epicenter was. Hence, it was a disaster. So there's a whole area of academic research called disaster risk reduction scholarship. Disaster risk reduction, how to reduce risks from disaster, it's all in the name. But they've basically had one central insight since about 1980, which they can, as we say in English, dine out on. You know, it's a great insight. People go, great idea. And it's this. And when I say it to you, it's going to sound ridiculous until I explain it. They have 2 sentences that sum this up. One is that earthquakes don't kill people, which sounds crazy. And the second is there's no such thing as a natural disaster, which also sounds crazy. But actually, let me complete both sentences. They don't say just earthquakes don't kill people. They say earthquakes don't kill people, collapsing buildings kill people. And the second point is there's no such thing as a natural disaster, because what they're saying is that the disaster part of it is social. It's worth pulling back for a second, because if we forget this, all of us here in this room, the clothing we're wearing, the meals we'll eat tonight, everything, the routines we have, how we got here, we are all the beneficiaries of not just years or decades or centuries, but actually millennia of sedimented human culture and understanding and problem solving. The weave of the jacket, this is probably made in China, almost undoubtedly, but actually the weave, the actual weave of it, has probably been around 10,000 years. The domestication of the materials in this, assuming it's not plastic, was something, again, that's come from 10,000 years of domestication. The food you eat is the same, the staple foods you eat. We always think we're very creative with our recipes, but we're basically using the same staples that were domesticated in 12,000 BC. And also even the routines we have, how we cross a road, how we adapt, wearing an umbrella and so on, all this stuff, we didn't just make it up. You know, if you made it up, you'd be a billionaire. Not a trillionaire, because you have to not be very creative to become a trillionaire. But otherwise, you know, we don't see it. We are all the beneficiaries of all this history. Rousseau once said, it's not the Romans who are ancient, it is we who are ancient, because we've been there much longer than them. That we have thousands more years of a sedimented experience that we're beneficiaries of. So, my point in saying that is that we forget something. The world doesn't like us, meaning like the natural world is trying to kill us, trying to eat us, trying to starve us, it's trying to freeze us. If you strip away the clothing we're wearing, the food we're eating, and you strip us of all of the accoutrements of culture for 3 days, I think we'd all be dead, even in this weather. Without the clothing and the fooding and all food and so on, we'd all get hypothermia. Even in the summer, we wouldn't last very long, 96 hours, maybe some of us. So we are all basically constantly protected from even the awareness of how hazardous the world is by culture, by society, by a culture and a society that is adapted to its context. We don't really think about it too much, but there's a reason why the roofs of buildings in Croatia are different than the roofs of buildings in Switzerland. Very different, flat, or like this, because they're facing different contexts. It's a classic case of adaptation. And what is adaptation? Well, we've had this idea of adaptation in the culture for the last few decades, where we talk about climate adaptation. Well, it's just a fancy technocratic word for something we've always had, which is just culture, all the stuff we've got. Okay, we don't need jargon to say that. It's just stuff that we've made up over a long time. It may seem simple, but someone had to invent it. And some of this stuff, it may seem obvious when it's there, but it took a long time to invent it. The wheel seems obvious, but they didn't invent it for quite a long time. So, my point here is that there is no such thing really as a natural disaster, or Anthony Oliver Smith would have said this, because actually if you look at these earthquakes, all the conditions of vulnerability were cultural. Okay, so why am I talking about an earthquake? Because this is about climate change. Well, because I think an earthquake is an extreme case of something in three contexts. What is an earthquake? Okay, it's a place, with an earthquake, you know exactly where it's going to happen, or where it happened, and how long it took, and how bad it was. You know, the epicenter was here, it lasted 45 seconds, and it was a 7.7 on the scale. So we know exactly all of those things. And yet, even when we know where, when, and how bad, we still can't determine the causal relationship between the earthquake and the outcome, because we know something else. If the same magnitude earthquake happens in a city of the same population density, and one of those cities is in Haiti, and one of them is in Japan, we all know, putting aside nuclear power plants, that there'll be more people surviving in Japan. Why? Because building regulations are different. Building materials are different. Levels of corruption are different. Emergency warning systems will be different. It's a wealthier culture. When we saw the earthquake in Turkey 3 years ago, a lot of those buildings, if you look what happened, the ground floor just collapsed and everything else pancaked down. Why? Because there was no building code around earthquakes. So depending on how you build and how you respond, it'll determine the social outcome. So my point is, even in the case of an earthquake, it's very hard to determine the social consequence of the earthquake. Okay, so why does it matter to climate change? Well, climate change is kind of the opposite. Because an earthquake is here, but climate change actually, if you look at it, if you look at the axes of understanding something, so like time, space, like when, where, and degree, like how you measure it. If an earthquake's very clear, here, for this long, this bad, climate change is by definition something very different, much more general. Does anyone here know the definition of climate change temporally? Like how, when we're saying change in climate change, what is change measuring? Anyone know? What scale of time? Heat? 30 year. Oh, it's good. It's exactly that. It's 30 year. So when we think of climate, we're not talking about the weather today or tomorrow or even this summer or even next year. The concept of climate change, the official definition of climate change, is a 30-year rolling average. So right now, 1996 to 2026, that's the 30-year window we're in right now. And it's not measuring the noise, it's measuring the signal. It's what is the overall pattern. Because we know, of course, in real life, some summers are hot, some are cold, sometimes it's dry, sometimes it's wet in the winter or the summer. That variation is normal enough. What climate change is referring to is the pattern, is the aggregate. Or the average, not the aggregate. So that's spatially, it's not something you can ever pin down as now. An earthquake is 45 seconds now. Climate change is longer than some people's professional careers, certainly in politics. So there is a temporal element to it. Spatially, what is climate change? Well, an earthquake is here. But what is the spatial dimension of climate change? Well, it's global anthropogenic climate change. It's not the temperature in one place. It's the temperature on average everywhere. And then take the third thing of measuring it, or measuring its impact. Well, we've already determined you can measure the earthquake, but you can't really draw a causal relationship between the earthquake and the social outcome, because there's so many social variables that come in between. But my argument is that with climate change, it's all, and that's something, by the way, you can pin down in space and time. But I'd put it to you that the challenge with climate change is that it's an analysis at such a level of abstraction, not unreality, it's true, I think, it's probably a valid claim, but the truth is we do not live our lives globally or at a 30-year rolling average. We live our lives today and here. We are currently, it's now 6 o'clock in Budapest on a, Tuesday. That's not climate change. Climate change is a much bigger thing. So my point is this, that given that policy making often has to be actions in particular places, Hungary, say now or in the next 4 years or 5 years, even China, they have 5-year plans, you know. Even with these sorts of things, our level of policy engagement and the level at which people live that the policy can be applied to, policy and politics are linked concepts, is a very different level of analysis from climate as an abstraction. My point here is not to say climate change is not real. My point is kind of more to say this, that the planet has always been there. A planetary frame of reference has not. That is something not only that is recent, but it's something that is only possible in the context of a whole range of conditions that are social, cultural, political over the last century and a half. For example, it's only in the last 100 or so years, maybe a bit longer, that we've even had it's only been a couple of hundred years since we knew it was a globe, first of all, very important. We've also only really had the political systems in the post-imperial period of actually having the whole planet managed by states with the same political operating systems that could speak to each other with diplomacy. There's a great example of how recent that wasn't the case. In the 1850s, in the Khanate of Khiva in the Caucasus, every year the Russians in the 1850s would send a diplomat, and he'd ride across the plains to try and get to this Khanate that had been there for hundreds of years. And every time when he got there with his gifts and his diplomatic seal from the Tsar, he'd just be beheaded and thrown off the wall. And that has happened over and over and over. They had no diplomatic protocol. You'd hate it. She has a diplomatic academy. This guy would not have been invited to the diplomatic academy. And that is until 1850. The concept of having a diplomatic academy is very much something more of the modern period since then. But additionally, other things. If you've got to measure climate change, you also need to have a standardization of measurements. Well, if you start looking at the history of how we standardize measurements, a lot of the measurements we use every day were only standardized in the 1960s. The 1890s for some early ones. Kilos, temperatures, Celsius, Fahrenheit, all these measurements were it was only when a bunch of guys in black tie got together in a room in Paris with a high ceiling sometime in the 1890s that we even started to think of doing that. Even the standardization of time zones, I mean, is so recent. Even just to think of that, even for me to say right now it's 6:05 in Budapest and I know that it's 7:05 in Bucharest, that is a modern concept. Why is it there? It's because of trains. Before that, if you got on your horse and you went somewhere, you say, when are you going to get there? Well, if I get there, it'll be in 3 days. But now I can say I'll be there at 4:02 and put the kettle on. Because we know exactly, because we're on machines that are traveling there. And when you have that sort of standardized time, you need time zones and so on. So it's only very recently that we even think in a way where we would have a global understanding with a political system where we can speak to everyone and get information, where we have standardization of even measurements, and indeed the technology to measure, plus the communications technology to communicate it. So the very concept of thinking about climate change in the way we do today is a sense. It may be an analysis of the planet, but it is as much an artifact of our current culture. It's as unimaginable to someone 200-300 years ago as a concept, an unimaginable concept, as us thinking about solar system, political economy would be today, although that may be changing this week. So what does all this amount to? Well, how much time have I got? Okay, so one thing I just want to add here before I kind of start thinking about wrapping up. There's an interesting question here about why we think this way. And because I think this sort of analysis of climate change is one that, as I said, it reveals more about our culture than I think it does about the world as such. And the question really is, I think for me anyway, like, why do we think this way? And I think that one of the challenges we've had is that we've started to think very mechanically about society. So, in our culture, we often take, as our way of understanding something, metaphors from other things that have been successful. So, for instance, when computing starts coming in, we start talking about networks quite a lot. And it's very interesting. If you go back to the 19th century, steam power was around. And what's very interesting, in Hungarian, the word for revolution is forradalom, the boiling over of the people, which is a much better word for revolution than the English word, frankly. But it's interesting because boiling over, which was forradalom, was used for 1848 and for 1956. Now, I don't know this for a fact, but I would be curious to know if forradalom was a word that emerged in the mid-19th century in the train age, because it's very much a steam-based, pressure-based metaphor. And my point is we draw our metaphors from the dominant technology. And I want to suggest to you an idea here, which is that, and I don't know if I have any slides here. Do I have any slides? I don't think hang on. Not Greta, not Dune, what do I want? Here we go. Right, I missed one of my slides before. Okay, so I had this sort of way of thinking. The question here is, why do we think about climate change the way we do? If I've made the case here that we can't actually draw a causal relationship between climate change and the social outcome, the question is, why do we keep thinking this way? What is bewitching us? Now, when I was growing up, my dad, who happens to be here, would often prove he was right in a discussion by saying, well, it's Newton's second law of motion. And I never quite knew what this was, but eventually I learned it in high school. And Newton has these 3 laws of motion, and I just want to talk you through them quickly. So the first one, because this is useful for understanding causality here, the first one, an object will not change its motion unless a force acts upon it. Okay, so something will stay in the same state unless you push it, or something. In space, it'll go forever unless it encounters something. The second is that the change in momentum or direction of the object will be proportional to the force applied. And the third is equal and opposite reaction. I push you and I go back. You slip on the banana peel, you go that way. This sort of thing. I think this is actually, we have adopted this mechanical understanding to how we understand ourselves. What do I mean? Well, if you think about what's implied in how we think about climate change, we sometimes assume that if it wasn't for climate change, society would remain just as it is. Everything's just fine until an outside force is applied to it. The object would remain at rest. So we assume that about ourselves in a sense. And then we kind of assume the amount of climate change will be proportional in some way to the amount of social change, the direction of it, how much, and so on. We kind of assume the worse climate change is, the worse it is for us. It's like a linear relationship in our heads. And the third, we kind of assume that every climate impact should be met with an equal and opposite resistance, that we should push back. And I kind of think we've sort of internalized this sort of causal thinking, this sort of mechanistic thinking. But I think to the extent to which we have, I want to put to you, it's totally flawed. For a very simple reason that, it is true that the natural world is a unity. The laws of physics and chemistry apply everywhere to everything equally. That's true. We know that. But I don't think you can say that about us, because we are not a unity. We are actually a plurality, which, by the way, is why we have politics. 2 of us can look at the same thing and disagree. And instead of killing each other, we go vote for a guy to make the laws. And so we are, and so we are a plurality in how we think. Indeed, quite frankly, most of us disagree with ourselves. I disagree with myself depending on how many cups of tea I've drunk. Right? Yeah, my view can change on things. And that's not a flaw, it's a feature of being human. It's what makes us human. It's absolutely essential to us. So we are inherently quite plural. And the problem is we've kind of imposed a sort of mechanistic model for understanding the physical world onto ourselves. And I know Rupert will talk more about this, but I just want to give an example here that think about how we assess, first of all, imagine this as an example. If we just had the objects in this room, not any people, although even people here, but if you were just bodies, not minds thinking. If I had perfect information on the room, perfect data, weights, density, everything, chemicals, I knew everything factually, and put it into a computer, and then I modeled dropping a grenade into the middle of the room in the computer. If I had perfect information, the model of how my grenade would behave is exactly basically what would happen in the room, like pretty close. So my point is that we can model that behavior. We can kind of predict what would happen in terms of the physics of it in the room. But the thing is, I could not predict how all of you would react if I dropped a grenade in the middle of the room. Some people would run out of the room, pretty smart. Some people would freeze. 1 or 2 foolish people would jump on the grenade to save everyone else, like Captain America in the quite good original Captain America movie. So the point is, it's not just that I don't know this, it's that you probably don't know how you'd react. There's a great film out there about a family on skiing holiday, and the whole premise is an avalanche comes towards them, and the dad just runs away. And the family learn that's what he's like, and then the film's about the family collapsing after that revelation. But he didn't know that, and they didn't know that. That's the human condition. So so my point here is that this sort of mechanistic understanding applies to things, sure, that's a unity. It does not apply to us, because we're a plurality. And again, that's not a fault, it's a feature of being human. That's just who we are, and it's really not a bad thing. It's who we are, inherently. It's everything we do is because of that. And so I think when we think about climate change more generally, I think sometimes embedded in how we think about climate change are not so much a set of assumptions about the natural world, but of a set of assumptions about ourselves that don't really hold up to much scrutiny. And as a consequence, I think we're sometimes being quite simplistic, not in how we think about climate, but how we think about society. There's an assumption climate will have a linear impact on society. Sometimes it's just an assumption that the only issue is the science of climate. And there's a broader issue here that is just to end on. The problem here is not really to the extent to which you buy my argument, the problem is not really about climate change. There's a broader question here about the status and role of science in society. Science is the most useful tool we have. Or it says, what is science? It's just a set of methods for doing stuff, for making things, getting things done, checking things. That's all it is. We don't have to be too fancy about it. And, but my point is that science is a useful tool in the service of our culture, but I don't think science should be treated as a value system that should dictate what our culture should be. It's kind of like, imagine you're building a house. So I know about the laws of physics because my dad spent most of his time sawing things on his weekends and building things. Still does. And the thing is, there is a difference between building a house and making a home. So he's pretty good at chopping up bits of wood and putting them up. My mum is pretty good at discovering what color to paint it. Right? It's very different. So he makes a very watertight house. Mum makes it kind of a home, no offense, but like, Mum adds a homely element to it. Right? And that's as it should be. But my point is that culture is kind of like this. Science is kind of like more like, science is closer to being a saw or a hammer than it is to being a sense of what the home should look like. And so the problem we've had in society, in my view, is we've seen society increasingly become so enamored by science that we think science isn't just a tool in service of our values, but that science should be a guide to what our values should be. It's really worrying. We saw it, for instance, in the COVID debate. I haven't got a view on whether COVID was made in a lab or not. I don't really care. It's irrelevant. But what was very interesting is when governments said they were starting lockdowns, they said, we're following the science. But actually, the science can tell you about the nature of the disease, and maybe it can tell you epidemiologically about how diseases spread in populations. But the question of what is an acceptable level of risk is not actually a scientific question. It's a question of values. It's a question of philosophy, and fundamentally, it's a political question, because there's no right answer. Because what is an acceptable level of risk is inherently subjective. If all of us here got in cars and drove to Vienna, we would all arrive at different times in the same car, driving at the same time, because we all assess risk differently. Some people drive very slowly, some people drive way too fast. And that's just, again, it's the plurality of us. It's the human condition. It's a feature. It's fine. It'd be strange if we didn't do that. So my point is that where they came to assessing risk, they said, oh, the scientists can tell us. But it just wasn't a scientific question. So all the people who should have been making subjective, difficult decisions that will always upset someone said, actually, let these experts deal with it. But they were not people who had anything to say on this issue. That, in philosophy of science, is called scientism. It's where we think science is a guide to our values. And the danger I see around the climate debate sometimes is not actually to do with the science. I'm not an expert on the science. The science looks pretty good. I'm happy to hear Rupert's views on this too. But I think the problem we have in society is the culture. There's too much deference to the science across all areas of our culture. And increasingly, we're putting so much of our lives in the hands of technology and so on. And this is a view also I imagine Gavin may push back on me a bit, because I think he's more interested in technocratic sort of big data approaches to solving problems. But my point in saying how to think about climate change is simply this. We live in such polarized times. There are so many issues where we're told to pick a side, this over side or this side, always being told this. But I think sometimes there is a third way of looking at it. You do not have to look at climate and be a climate activist saying, climate's the worst thing in the world, that's the end of the story, it's a consensus, no discussion. Because there may well be a scientific consensus, I still don't know what to do with that information at a social level. And you also don't have to take the other position of saying the science is all wrong, it's all corrupt, it's made up, it's fake news. You don't have to say that either. You can actually say, look, the science may be pretty good, but what do I do about that? And you can start focusing on the social questions. And that's just not the question that can be addressed. It's kind of the question that needs to be addressed. Or indeed, it doesn't just need to be addressed, it's one that can be addressed. Because few of us, some of us maybe are experts in the science, but we can all have some understanding of society. It shouldn't be such an expert topic. Okay, so to how to think about climate change, my point in this has just been really just to say that I think that when we think about these sorts of issues, the big problem I see is the whole debate is so polarized, so political, and there's no room in that to actually think for oneself without being sucked into one or the other tribe. And we see that everywhere. We see it in politics everywhere. And I don't know about you guys, but I'm pretty sick to the back teeth of being given two options that are both like caricatures of each other, and which need each other to survive. They hate each other so much they're defined in opposition. It's really boring. Like, quite apart from being unproductive, it's incredibly boring. And what's more interesting, and I think more constructive for society, is to find common ground. And the common ground is rarely the answers, because we have different answers. At least we can agree on the questions, or agree that perhaps we should try investing time in asking different questions. Okay, so that's the end of my long monologue, and I'll hand it over to Rupert on the screen. But thank you very much, Kusanam Sepan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nicholson, and I believe we have Rupert on the screen behind us. Rupert, do you want to respond to that? I guess I was thinking about it in terms of static and dynamic modelling, and the idea that, we don't tend to feed the answers that we get as we go along into the model is one form of static and dynamic modelling. Another form is just what Calum has just so eloquently described, this sense that human beings are fluid and they will adapt to changing situations. The classic example in economics is if the price of coffee goes up, people substitute more tea. In the case of climate change, we've seen that people will, who are just normal Americans, have the chance to live in any climatic zone, are increasingly moving southwards to the warmer parts of the country. And again, grounds are being opened up in Canada and wherever, where potentially, new civilizations could be built. Old towns like just Detroit are fading away. So what is it about the dynamism of humanity and the dynamism of modeling that we are missing?
Well, Gavin, it's great to be joining you. I'm only joining you in your condemned man cell. My only regret is I'm not physically with you in Europe's most vibrant, most beautiful city. It is an honour to address a meeting at the Danube Institute with your stellar reputation for thinking the forbidden. And that's what I hope to contribute a little this afternoon to that. And first of all, Gavin, I'd like to take up the question you posed before Calum's remarks, which was, what risks are worth mitigating? Because there's a very important essay, which I've mentioned to Calum, written in 1983 by Mary Douglas, an anthropologist, and Aaron Wildavsky, the political scientist. And in that essay, they argued that the belief that there is no moral judgment involved in risk selection implies that major dangers are so obvious that they hit the mind like a beam of light on the retina. And this, they argued, was a misperception. Rather, risks are culturally determined. Each arrangement elevates some risks to a high peak and depresses others below sight. And what I'd like to do, taking on from that, is to challenge what I think is one of the great myths of our time, which is that scientists are the guardians of some kind of objective truth. And one can see that from the way they treat climate change as distinct from the risk of a lab leak causing a pandemic. So in the 10 years up to 2019, I asked ChatGPT, how many articles on climate change did the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists publish in those 10 years? And the answer was 50 to 60. Then asked how many on the potential of a lab leak causing a pandemic, and it was 5 or 6. And among those 5 or 6 was an absolutely astonishing article, which said the probability of a lab leak of a potential pandemic pathogen being leaked from one of the 42 labs carrying out such research in the world, there was an 80% probability of a lab leak happening once every 12.8 years. So this was a very serious risk if you looked at it objectively. Yet the scientists, the community of scientists as a whole, completely downplayed that risk. And then if you go to the Union of Concerned Scientists, which is one of the most vocal outfits of science, and they on their website, they will tell you, we are here to solve the planet's most pressing problems. There are a lot of articles on climate change. There wasn't a single one on the potential of a lab leak causing a pandemic. So the second aspect of this is something I don't think Gavin saw that Calum mentioned, which is catastrophism. that baked into this is, and baked into climate change is the notion that, or the risk or the danger that climate change is catastrophic. And what I would argue is that scientists are predisposed to believe in catastrophism, and my evidence for that is from the 1970s, because we're not. This isn't the first time we've had scientists telling us that what modern civilization is doing could cause a catastrophe. And during that period, there was a working group of British scientists and one economist who looked at pollution. The argument then was pollution was going to cause society a planetary catastrophe. And the economist in question was Wilfred Beckerman, who was a very interesting man. He was an advisor to Labour governments to Anthony Crosland. And 2 years after working with these scientists, he wrote, "Scientists who might be world authorities on phenomena pertaining in the physical world, quote, do not have a minimal understanding of the way that the world of human beings operates in general, or in particular, the way that society reacts to problems such as pollution and demands for raw materials." And he said, some scientists might have decided to become scientists precisely to shield themselves from these phenomena and to escape into a world where problems are not on a human scale, but microscopic or astronomic. And I think Calum's mentioned Newton's three laws of physics, of motion. And I think there's one thing that informs scientists' misunderstanding of human society. And those are the laws of thermodynamics. I can't remember which one in particular, whether it's the first or the second, about the conservation of energy. Because to them, a perpetual motion machine cannot exist. And they look at the human economy, they look at the economy as the attempt to create a perpetual motion machine, which must consume the resources it depends upon. But what non-scientists know, and particularly economists know, is that the economy is really an accretion of human knowledge. That's what propels economies. And so we have this clash of if you like, a fatal misunderstanding on the part of physical scientists about the nature of human society. Now, I mentioned catastrophism and why this is different, why climate change is different from the catastrophism of the early 1970s. And that is because catastrophism, if you like, is ubiquitous amongst the Western elites. They have bought into this, and it's partly a form of moral blackmail that if you object or resist efforts to tackle climate change and cut emissions and so forth, you are risking a planetary catastrophe. You are a deeply immoral person because you are risking your grandchildren's future. And that has led to some really bad thinking and bad policies. However, I think catastrophism is on its way out, particularly in the United States with the Donald Trump's second election win in 2024 and the vibe shift. And then if you look what Bill Gates wrote in October last year, where he basically buried climate catastrophism, but that hasn't happened on this side of the Atlantic. And catastrophism, in my view, is absolutely essential to, if you like, climate change as an ideology, because it exists on a Malthusian substructure of sin, punishment, and redemption. And if you take away catastrophism, you take away the meaning of the prospect of salvation. And salvation is an incredibly powerful idea in quite extreme political ideologies, whether one can look at Marxism, where the prospect of salvation was in terms of the dictatorship of the proletariat. And similarly, salvationism, we see that in the environmental movement. So I think I am in very strong agreement with Calum on his view that the physical sciences can tell us what would happen if you throw a grenade into a room. And absolutely, the physical scientists are very, very poor at telling what the impact will be on human societies.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Dr. Nicholson, I mean, I guess there was a lot in there, just on the general point.
Well, I mean, I think something he got at there about the sort of cult of salvation. I mean, it's something I didn't mention before, but so I'm an anthropologist, and I'm quite interested in millenarian movements. And so millenarian movements, so in the course of human history, there are periods, well, I should probably reframe this. So in our own lives, we have liminal periods. It could be a ceremony, a wedding, or a bar mitzvah or something. And it could also be like university. And what often happens is you have one period of your life where you do things one way, and then you go into a liminal period where all the norms are inverted, and usually there's a ceremony master guiding you through that, and then afterwards you emerge in a new situation, a new stage of your life. So before you're married, in the wedding there's a priest or something overseeing it, or bar mitzvah there's the rabbi, and but actually university there's kind of in principle the professor looking after you, though I don't think they often do, and but then you're in university for a few years, but during that ceremony often the norms are inverted, and it's quite interesting with university as an example. Beforehand you're at school wearing a uniform, cut your hair. At university, grow your hair out, drink too much, get up at crazy times, and then you emerge afterwards into the working world, you cut your hair again, and you progress to the next stage. But there was an anthropologist who said liminal stages also exist in complex societies. Between one era and another, there are periods of transition where all the norms are inverted and flipped upside down. And he said the problem with those, actually often there is not a ceremony master overseeing that transition, precisely because the whole point of the change is the usual sources of authority have been thrown out. And so you could actually see Germany as an example of this, that after World War I, one era ended, it entered a liminal period for some decades where no one was really culturally in charge. It was quite a creative space, but then ultimately a charismatic individual arose, as often happened, who then manipulates people and divides people. And so we know what happened. And so, but throughout human history this happens, and millenarian movements are often ones that emerge in these contexts. Millenarian movement being one where people think the world is in sin, we need to confront the sin and emerge into some new utopia. And some are more millenarian, some are more apocalyptic. You could see ISIS as a version of this, a more apocalyptic one. ISIS emerged in the wake of the collapse of Saddam's regime and the changes in the Middle East, and emerged as a sort of messianic sort of movement to try and change everything. In their own mind, they thought for the better. But actually, this happened throughout history. And I find it very interesting that right now in the West, we're facing quite a number of these. We've faced suddenly in the last 10, 12 years, we've had the emergence of several millenarian movements. The social justice movement, whatever its merits, is a millenarian movement. It's saying the world is an oppressive, racist thing, or whatever it may be, and that we must confront that and establish the utopia. QAnon actually was similar, saying the world is run by a bunch of Satanist pedophiles, we need to confront that and establish a post-pedophile utopia. And then you've got the climate movement, which is really saying we've been sinning against the planet. We need to confront this and establish some sort of utopia. What I find kind of interesting, and I don't want to sound too conspiratorial about this because it's not my point, but there's something very interesting because millenarian movements the concept comes from the millennium of in the year running up to the year 1000, in France in particular, there was an increasing sense that on the millennium of Christ's birth, he would return, and Judgment Day would come, and so on. And everyone got quite feverish about it. And when it didn't happen, they calmed down for a little bit. And then around 1020, they said, maybe it's the anniversary of his death. He died at 33. So then in the build-up of 1033, everyone got really excited again, and then nothing happened, and they pretended like nothing had happened. What I find really interesting is that we live in a secular society largely now, but of course the waters we swim in are still Christian in structurally in Europe. And I think it's quite interesting that in the run-up to the year 2000, there was this feverish worry about like Y2K and the end of the world and Judgment Day, this kind of computerized catastrophe, which didn't happen because we kind of solved it, but it didn't happen. And what I think is really interesting is in the last few years, we've started to really worry about climate change. And often people are saying the tipping point is a few years away. And it's always sometimes it was always like the 2030s maybe is the tipping point. If you don't solve it by then. And I literally saw the other day, someone said the tipping point will be 2033. I thought, well, it's the millennium again. It's the second millennial movement. But in a society that is so secular now, it doesn't even know it's Christian anymore. But it's almost like the idea is the patterns of history are still there. I'm not saying that as a conspiracy. I don't mean it that way. What I mean is almost sometimes I think we are so caught up with current affairs, we often miss the tides of history that sweep us along, and I think that's one of them. So I do think this point about salvation made me think of millenarian movements, and I think a lot of the way we can understand climate culturally is in the context of millenarian thinking.
I guess millenarian thinking is one way of developing it. The other is maybe a loss of confidence or a loss of faith by the elite, and I'm not really sure which one to go with, because in one way, it seems like there was a sort of a trajectory where the West was on top, and climate change dialogue is a Western dialogue. The Chinese are not interested in this. And then at a certain point, we began to go into long-term decline. You can say that was the 1960s or 70s. But then that decline sort of petered out, and there was a sort of a phase of uplift in the 90s, the fall of the Cold War, and suddenly you had a zone of peace and prosperity, and then suddenly you had the real end of history, and we were all, I mean, when I think about, and I was thinking about this today, when did I first start really noticing this in the culture? And it was 2006, and I think it had been percolating from about 2004. Not quite sure what year the Al Gore film was.
Six.
Yeah.
Six, yeah.
Yes. And then so suddenly you have these two competing narratives, where is this because we are declining and therefore panicking and need something to cling to, need something to fix our horizons on? Or is it because we are living in this sort of bubble of abstraction and our elites need something to focus their intent on? And you could feel that cultural boredom in the early 2000s, despite 9/11, which should have given us a good fixed point. Rupert, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I think the precondition for the rise of environmentalism and for climate catastrophism was the collapse of communism and the collapse of socialism more generally. And what that led to was the collapse in the belief that we can create heaven on earth. And so, if you like, the broad left was looking for some other challenge, for some other mission. And environmentalism provided them with that mission. And in doing so, they forsook their historic role as the parties that advance the interests of the working class. And I think that explains why you've had, if you like, movements from the right, such as the election of Donald Trump, Brexit, and so forth, because the parties of the left have basically given up on working people because their mission is to save the planet from climate change. I think the other thing in terms of the elites, and something that I've come to sort of view more recently, is the impact of the financial crisis of 2008. I think it was a profound trauma on the mentality, the mindset of Western elites. And you can look at the different, you can actually trace this, because in 2006 there was a G8 in St. Petersburg where the leaders of the West signed up to the St. Petersburg Principles of Energy Security, which literally called for the investment of trillions of dollars in the oil industry. Now, 3 years later, 2009, the G8 at L'Aquila, the first one Barack Obama attended, the first one after the financial crisis, it was all about green recovery and about fighting climate change. And two things that happened between those two G8s was the financial crisis and the election of Barack Obama. So I think almost climate change is therapy, is a form of therapy for the profound trauma of the financial crisis.
Yeah, I'd kind of add, well, agree with both of you. And there's three things I think. One is when you say that climate change is a Western phenomenon, Gavin, I think this is it's actually even more so than that. I think it's a Protestant product. And what I mean is this, that I think Max Weber said the greatest legacy of Protestantism was secularism. in a sense. And it's within the secular context and this post-Protestant culture that we've seen climate emerge as an issue. It's coming out of, the UK, it's coming out of North America. It's no coincidence that Greta is a Swede, It's not coming out of Catholic countries, it's not coming out of Orthodox countries, it's not coming out of Islamic cultures, it's not coming out of Hindu cultures, it's not coming out of Confucian cultures. It's coming out of the Protestant Western cultures, which coincidentally, for interesting historical reasons, namely the result of World War II, are the people in whose image the world's geopolitical architecture is fashioned. If you look at the United Nations and so on, all of these institutions were really forged by a bunch of guys who were on the winning side, really led by the Americans. The Russians were kind of involved. But essentially it was a Protestant movement. The architecture of the world, the language, the currency, everything is to do with the Protestant West, essentially. And if in the U.S. is a Protestant country. I mean, they've got, even when Kennedy was a Catholic, became president, it was very controversial at the time. We think of it less so now, but it's been mostly Protestant. So I'd say it's these millenarian movements come out of the Protestant movements typically, which is not that surprising because it is a sort of more feverish part of Christendom in a sense. The Reformations in a sense were a series of millenarian movements. John of Leyden was a classic millenarian cult in Munster. So first Protestant. Second is, I think, one of the key elements in this emerging narrative was the Green Movement coming out of the 70s. I'm not the first to say this, but in the I think 1969 or 70, someone took a picture of Earth from returning from the moon, and you saw it as this fragile blue-green planet, and that was the image that sparked a lot of the modern sort of green movement. But I think speaking to something that Rupert just said, I think is crucial, where he's just said about the end of the Cold War, and Gavin referenced the end of history, and communism. But I think it's kind of in two ways. I'd agree with Rupert that, in a sense, people who'd been former sort of communist sympathizers had to find new left-wing issues to be interested in. And I think that's true, because it is true the Green Movement seems to be just a reupholstered socialist movement in many ways. But there's also an additional thing, which is that for mainstream security-oriented people, like people studying security or the Pentagon or whatever it is, it's very interesting. During the Cold War, they were concerned with political threats, the Soviet Union, if they're in the West. But after 1991 or 1992, they had to find new things to be worried about. And those became less political threats as apolitical risks. You start to see the rise of a risk-averse culture. Something I was just walking around today, showing my dad around Budapest, and occasionally there's you walk along in front of the parliament and there's the great 15-foot drop, and there's no barrier. I love it. It's so nice not to be nannied by the state. But then we get to the steps up and there's holes in the steps and I said to Dad, what I love about Hungary? It's a culture that hasn't discovered the lawsuit yet. It's amazing. Because if this is America, people would be loving that, because that's a lifelong $1 million handout, right? It's an amazing thing about Hungary that no one thinks to litigate for these things. But the Anglosphere has been taken over by this sort of culture where any risk is very tantalizing to any lawyer because they can draw red tape around it and sue someone. When I was a kid in Canada, you could go on school trips, and the teacher would say, right, we're going off on a school trip. Now you can't take kids on school trips, just the paperwork involved makes it virtually impossible. So we live in this risk-averse culture, which has bled into everything, means that our preoccupation is often with structural risks and predictive risks and so on, rather than it is on actual threats of people with weapons, although weapons are coming back into fashion, it seems.
Yeah, there's a lot in there. Okay, so we were talking about the new left, I suppose. Rupert made a very excellent point that this is where the left went next. And I suppose there are many lefts that are constantly kind of constellating and intertwining. And this is a key thread. And I guess I'm just wondering about whether we have the left we deserve in this instance. So in some ways, the right is always in dialogue with the left, and we are constantly kind of remodeling what the left can and should be. And it seems that, how do we, if today is a day for thinking about things from the anthropic, there is a version of the left that I think we would all understand and respect, which is what you might call in the UK, I don't know, the Maurice Glassman left or the Frank Field left, which is about the dignity of work, the preservation of a certain vision of traditional culture. the capacity to get up and move on in life. But we seem to have this rather kind of ugly and cultish left that has grown up in modern times that feels unrecognizable. There's a certain dysphoria that comes with where we are now in even talking to the left, in part because of what you said. They are millenarian, and they are perhaps Protestant millenarian, and they have a quite lock-sealed view. So I guess one question is, how do we then talk to them? How do we deprogram them? How do we bring them back into dialogue with the right? Is it through finding conjoined projects, or is it through another analysis?
Well, I'm curious what Rupert thinks on this too, but just quickly from me, well, it's kind of what my talk is about, that I think that we're so polarized. And the problem with the polarization we have is that the difference between the center left and center right and the far left and the far right, in a sense, is that the center left and center right agreed on the problem, they disagreed on the solution. So they say the problem's the economy, do you need more state or less state? The problem with the far left and the far right, they think they disagree not just on the solution, but disagree on the problem, precisely because they think the problem is each other. It's very ad hominem, they're really attacking each other. And I'm sick to death of that culture. If you go online, the Twitter space is entirely everyone calling each other idiots. And it's not constructive. It's not constructive. It's very immature, quite frankly. And whatever we think of the merits of various politicians as forces of nature, I can't say our current political crop is raising the maturity of the dialogue in any country. And so it's so I think that there is I wonder sometimes if it's so much. So I've been trying to argue that we should find questions we agree on. But I think also we're in a period of the culture, if you pull back, it's a feverish period of the culture. We're in a millenarian time, but my point is the millenarianness is a symptom of the pathology. There are deeper problems at play, and until we diagnose those, we won't cure it, which is kind of my point, that it's not enough just to get people to agree to your answer. You've got to both recognize a common problem. And I think right now we're so trapped in saying the problem's each other, we're not identifying the culture that is making us think that.
Rupert, can we have a common problem? Is there such a thing?
I think in terms of the conversation that the left needs to have is a conversation with reality. And there are two big downsides to climate change policy. One is economic, and that there are trillions and trillions of euros being spent on trying to decarbonize economies, which is why the economic performance of Europe has been so lamentable. And that spills over into that creates massive social tensions. I love the, Calum mentioned the word in Hungarian for revolution being boiling over, because that's what socially I think we're heading for as a result of prolonged economic stagnation. The other is geopolitical, and the failure to recognize geopolitical risk and geopolitical threat. So on the eve of the Russo-Ukrainian war, there was a meeting in Stockholm of the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe. And the US ambassador went there to brief his colleagues that he was trying to warn them that there was about to be a major war in Europe about to happen. And all they wanted to talk about was climate change. Literally all they wanted to talk about was climate change. And the Canadian ambassador said the statement on climate change wasn't strong enough because it didn't say enough about women and climate change. So this is in a way, this is the problem, as I say, is actually understanding the economic and the geopolitical reality.
Yeah, and I actually, on that, should we talk about South Africa and the trip to the...
Sure.
Okay.
Just turn it into a buddy comedy.
No, this is actually... So Gavin and I, a few months ago, to speak to what Rupert just said, we went to South Africa on a conference. And we were there, and we met a very, very nice guy who ran a special economic zone. And his purpose of that special economic zone was to provide employment for a poor, almost like shanty town there, like a slum almost, I think it was, that's surrounding this special economic zone. And so his job is to provide employment for hundreds of thousands of people. And he was very proud of telling us that he had people coming, and he had a Chinese investor coming to look at the site, and he was telling us about their policy. And I said, so what's the strategy? How do you decide who takes part of the industrial estate, builds a factory, employs local people? He says, we demand, he said, that they abide by certain climate things, but also that half of their leadership must be women. And what he was doing is he was coming with a set of ideological preconceptions. And I said, well, look, how much competition do you have? And he said, there were 30 of these zones across South Africa. I said, so the Chinese are going to come here, and they want to be here, and you're going to say, if you don't have 50% women in the thing, then no thanks, no jobs, and they'll go somewhere else where they will give it to them. And what was fascinating is this guy whose job it was to find jobs for these poor people in that community, his main preoccupation was aligning with the ideological preconceptions that were still popular perhaps in the European Commission. They were not even popular in America right now under the Trump administration. And I don't think the Chinese government were particularly preoccupied with them either. But the fact that this guy, his preoccupation with these very left-wing sort of shibboleths, these orthodoxies, to the cost of, and I remember, do you remember?
Well, I mean, my father actually, I grew up in Cape Town near this site, relatively near, and my father actually was an industrial engineer, and he would go out and work in Atlantis, and I, as a young reporter, did some stories kind of going out into the townships and talking to people in Atlantis, and so, yeah, my blood just sort of boiled over listening to this rather pedantic German woman on the other side of the aisle talk to us about this sort of stern orthodoxy that don't worry, this will all be made up for in carbon credits, and this entirely enclosed sort of circular economy where the first world was paying the third world not to produce effectively. That is a new form of imperialism by any stretch.
And the additional thing on that, at a structural level, that's what they were doing. But the reality was on the ground, in that community, is that those people would have no jobs. Now, at a structural level, perhaps the third world gets some money, but that community, who these people were employed to serve, would not be served in the service of an ideological agenda that actually didn't serve anyone. And so this is where I find it quite extraordinary, where the left seem to have captured a monopoly of a sense that they are the moral actors in the service of human rights and human interest. And I wonder, well, where is the human in those interests? I see structural state interests, but I don't see individuals. And it was quite a striking case, because you mentioned the stern orthodoxy was true. She would absolutely it was like dealing with a cleric in like the 14th century. It was diamantine confidence in her position. She was not open to even being questioned.
Yeah, she was not engaged. She was not in the room. She did not see the poverty in a strange kind of way, or she felt that this was all, a structural thing. That back at our air-conditioned conference, wonderful conference, love the ORF, but there were fantastic vol au vents basically, and she was on her way from another climate conference. I think COP 29 and a half or whatever it was, which, again, just seemed like sort of platinum cards everywhere, and a jolly good jolly was had by all, and that all these pieces could be moved around the map while all these people, in Atlantis dealt with alcoholism, drug addiction, and all the rest of it that goes into that slightly ungodly place.
Yeah,
Should we bring in Rupert at this point? I'm conscious of the clock too. How long?
Well, just to let you know, we actually have to close by 7, I've been told. So we should probably have a final comment from Rupert, and then open up for the last couple of questions, I think. Rupert.
I would just urge everyone to get inoculated against climate change by attending a COP. That is absolutely the best way to see the whole thing in its raw ugliness, because there you have a bunch of people who are saving the planet and incredibly pleased with themselves, and you have people who are going to be making huge amounts of money out of the same thing at the same time. And it really is one of the, I was actually arrested at the COP in Marrakesh and thrown out, but that they really are something. If you ever get the chance, go to one, but for 2 or 3 days, that'll be enough to change your view on it.
I went to one in Dubai, and I wrote a piece you can find on the Hungarian Conservative called "Cop Out in Dubai," which is a good title. And it was quite extraordinary. It was really just the lanyard class at play, and it was quite disgusting, actually, I found, honestly.
It's a very good piece if you ever get the chance to look it up. Available on all periodicals, is it?
And available in one periodical. Download it now.
Okay,
Yes.
in our periodical.
Indeed, yes.
Okay, very good. Well, last chance to see you, folks.
Last chance. So
So, yes.
questions.
Okay, we're going to go to questions.
Well, very
Okay,
quickly, we
fantastic.
take 2 questions, and we get a hard cut in a few minutes. So
Okay, well, we'll see how elastic time becomes. So, do we have any questions?
anyway, I know there's a man here,
Yes,
but make
the
sure it is.
gentleman in the front.
Make sure it
yes,
is a
the
question.
Handsome gentleman in the check shirt.
Yeah.
I've just nabbed the mic. Only one person, Rupert.
Hold it here.
Who's here?
Yeah, not that close.
Rupert, you're the only person that actually mentioned to save the planet in this discussion. And it's the thing that has always infuriated me. And the simple reason is, if you actually really wanted to save the planet, what you should do is let the species die and let everything resolve itself when we get a wonderful planet back. And we really, really should stop anyone ever using, every single cop comes out, save the planet, save the planet, save the planet. Load of rubbish.
Is there a question?
It's because the best way to save the planet is to wipe out human species. We need to get the terminology right.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because there's kind of like sometimes, it's actually a very interesting point. I know that you're being a bit facetious, but it's interesting when people talk about net zero, and indeed like when zero COVID, I remember too, it's actually quite possible to have had zero COVID if everyone locked up in their houses forever. It's actually quite possible to have zero carbon or net zero if no one ever does anything again, but life still has to be lived, and at what cost? So kind of implied in these ideas is precisely the point, people saying, well, just stop being a human being, stop existing, and to what end at that point? So this is where I find some of the thinking around this quite utopian to the point of it being a form of violence. Any other questions? And try and make them questions. Yeah, thanks.
I'm from Canada, and we used to have a conservative leader, a gentleman named Preston Manning, who always used to say that if he could marry an environmental stewardship with conservative policies, he could win every election in Canada. Do you see any hope or optimism there that if conservatives or more right-wing people pushed a little bit more with stewardship and economic policies, that actually we could win?
I think there's a lot in that. I don't know what Rupert has to say, but let's pass that to Rupert. Rupert.
Actually, I could just make one remark about Canada. At the time of the Brundtland Report, which was brought in the idea of sustainable development, more Canadians replied to or sent in submissions to the Brundtland Commission. It also had, I think, 3 Canadians on the commission, including Maurice Strong. And I've written somewhere that was actually Canada's peak historical impact on the world in terms of pushing sustainable development, and with it global warming on the political agenda. I think it was the Brundtland Report was 1987. So that's not my answer to your question. It's just a point about Canada.
And I just add to it that I think you're right that you could combine those two, because one of the problems we've had is this new climate fixation is actually a very sort of high-level technocratic abstract understanding, sort of data-y sort of understanding of the environment, whereas old-school environmentalism was more about or just being conscious of the land and our place in it and a certain respect for it. And I grew up in various places. We grew up in places, farming communities, and my parents live in a farming community, and it's very interesting that the way that you see the rhythms of the seasons and so on, and just it gives you a very different perspective with people who have to worry about the harvest. It gives you an entirely different understanding of it that you don't learn in an MSc in environment. And so there's something about people actually being engaged with reality and living in it as opposed to just studying it in the abstract. One last question, I think.
One more question. One more question.
Any more? Okay, well, in which case, that's great. We can have time to close everything down.
Okay. Well, yeah. Do you want to end it, or one more question to the panel, or just?
No, we can just wrap it up.
That's your lot, right? Okay. Well, thank you very much, folks. It's been a fascinating evening. Thank you to our guest, Rupert Darwell, who's been fantastic. And thank you to you, Calum TM Nicholson.
Thank you. And I just want to add one thing on this. I mean, so as Gavin has hinted, we don't really know what the future holds for the Institute. I think this is not secret. But I've been here for 2 years, and actually I came here 5 years ago as a visiting fellow, and I've known Melissa for 5 years. And I want to say something. The Danube Institute has been an amazing place the last 5 years. We've done some incredible events. We've had some great audiences. We've had some great speakers. And I have to say, my colleagues here at the Danube Institute are the loveliest bunch of people. And I'm not going to cry or anything, but don't even tempt me. But it's very moving. And it's been an incredible 5 years. Particularly the last 2, I've been director of research here. And the people I've got to work with, there's a few in the room, people like Sean, visiting fellow, Gavin, best person I know, Melissa, who's been just fantastic the last 5 years, always fighting for everyone to make sure that everything functions and works. And then friends at other institutes like Liliana is over at Ludovica and so on. And then interns like Esther and Attila, just so talented, so helpful. Adam, where's Adam? Adam, there's Adam. Adam of all people. Adam, he's just incredible. And it's been a really nice team. And actually it's been kind of like, we've got a great WhatsApp group where we have a lot of just great conversations and good memes, which has been fun. And it's just been a great experience. And there's people not here right now. John O'Sullivan's away and Ishfan's away. Amazing people. You couldn't make better people. So it's a community, and we've done events. And if you read online, sometimes we look controversial. But we're not actually that controversial. We're kind of a bit too dorky to be too controversial, honestly. We've got the nerve center of the comms department. We've got the nerd center of the research department, where all the nerds hang out. And it's been a great experience. And so we don't really know what the future holds. It's been great community, all of you, including the audience, so many people who come here so often. So thank you very much to everyone. And it's been a real ride. And keep coming as long as we're here, and keep watching this stuff, and let's have drinks and so on. Thank you. Köszönöm szépen.
Thanks so much, people.